and cell and molecular biology. If you haven't yet, we do also have some light snacks for refreshments for today's evening talk. So if you haven't, please do, throughout the talk or throughout this evening, please do make your way to the back for some light refreshments. So if you're not familiar with what Relevant series is, Relevant is a week-long series of dialogues and talks about faith, culture, science, life, and more topics that are relevant to students today. And so this is a collaboration event with several Christian campus fellowships and organizations that made this event possible. And so we have talks throughout this week, not only on Mondays, but Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays of this week. So if you're interested in any of those talks, please do check out our website at relevantseries.com and also our Instagram page at relevantUFT. So for today's talk, we are going to be going through a historical and medical analysis of the death and resurrection of Jesus, which will be given by none other than our amazing guest speaker, Dr. Raphael Samuel. And so, as Dr. Raphael is going to be giving his talk today, we encourage everyone to listen charitably, respect one another, ask questions, and also if you have any amazing conversations that are happening during the event, we invite you guys to continue those conversations afterwards. There are also going to be some Relevant Series volunteers, including myself. We also have all these lanyards, so if you're interested to ask any questions, we would love to converse with you. And as this is a collaboration with Christian fellowships, all these talks are coming from a Christian perspective, and so, but even so, we would like to welcome everybody to attend, no matter what your beliefs are or your views, and all we want to do is just spark some amazing dialogue and conversations. And after the talk as well, we also have a time for Q&A. And so now I'll be introducing our amazing guest speaker. So Dr. Raphael Samuel is a Christian speaker, apologist, and anesthesiologist in Ontario, Canada, born in Durban, South Africa. And so he obtained his medical degree and master's degree in medicine there. He then further obtained fellowships in anesthesiology from the Colleges of Medicine of South Africa and the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. And so he's currently completing his master's degree in Christian apologetics at Talbot School of Theology at Biola University in Southern California on a part-time basis. And so apart from general apologetics, his other areas of interest include pro-life advocacy, human consciousness as evidence for the soul, and the evidence for God from the human body. And he currently lives in Hamilton with his wife, Reshmi, and his 2 sons. And so now, please give a warm round of applause for Dr. Raphael.
Hi, guys. So good to be here with you guys, and thank you for coming out on this cold Canadian winter day. My topic today is on the death and resurrection of Jesus, and it is going to be a very brief analysis, historical and medical. Just a little bit about myself. Some of you may have attended this earlier talk of mine and been concerned about my accent. Yes, it is a South African accent. And I'd just like to have you know that it was voted the 14th most attractive accent in the world. It did come in just above Braille. So I am a practicing anesthesiologist. I'm also an adjunct speaker with Apologetics Canada and a member of the board of directors there. But my day job is anesthesia. So if you all fall asleep by the end of this talk, I will consider it a job well done. I am from this beautiful city of Durban, South Africa. It's a bustling port city on the east coast of South Africa. Some of you may know it from BBC Earth and Discovery Channel because we have this phenomenon called the sardine run, where billions of sardines are chased by predators, and actually a lot of them land up on the shore there along the east coast of South Africa. So we like to claim that we have found the missing link, which is a running sardine. Another beautiful city that I live in currently is Hamilton, Ontario, which is the waterfall capital of actually the world. I was surprised to know. So my family and I, in our spare time, we like jumping out of waterfalls. So let's get to the death and bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, if you ask me my professional opinion, dead people do not rise from the dead. So now that we have come to that conclusion, we can all go home. But this is the audacity and the extraordinary nature of the central claim of Christianity, that a dead person is now alive. And the thing about the death and bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ is that it is a historical event, meaning that it did occur at a particular time, at a particular geographical location, and involved particular historical people. Now, this makes Christianity quite unique amongst all other religions because it's not about a spiritual experience or a good practical or moral teaching, but its central claim is about a historical event. And therefore, this claim can be tested historically by the historical method. So it's either true or false, but what it can never be is relatively true. Now, I came to realize this rather the hard way. And I also realized that if you love your belief or your worldview more than you love the truth, what you end up doing is loving a lie and living an illusion. Now, let me make myself clear. If Christianity is false, I don't want anything to do with it, and I wouldn't want any of you to have anything to do with it. Now, it's not me saying this. This is the Apostle Paul saying this in 1 Corinthians 15. And if Christ has not been raised from the dead, then all our preaching is useless and your faith is useless. We are more to be pitied than anyone in the world. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead. Now, this is odd language for someone who's religious. Because Paul here is claiming objectivity. He's claiming a fact. And there's no blind faith involved here. He's actually claiming objectivity. And you see, the earliest Christians did not become Christians because of what they were taught about the good moral way of life Christianity is. They became Christians because they were witnesses of something, that they saw something, not because Christianity was popular or even good. Now, Andrew Dhanipasad sent me this picture a few days ago on the text, and he didn't know how I would respond to that picture. But when I saw that picture, I thought, wow, God really has an amazing sense of humor, because I was a student once, last century, and I remember sitting in the lounge area of the medical school, and one of my classmates was putting up a poster. And it was the poster of a church that was going to be established in the university, and it was an invitation to come and visit the church. And the church was called His People. And I remember so clearly having a lol moment. Wow, who would name a church His People? Who would even go to such a church? And I laughed ridiculously to myself. Well, unfortunately for me, or fortunately for me, 6 years later, that church became my home for the next 11 years. So I'm not sure whether you are one of those people putting up the posters or posting these things online, or whether you are one of those skeptical scoffers sitting like me in the lounge laughing at the poster. I just want to welcome you here, and just to say that if you are skeptical, I'm not here to convert you. That's not my job. I'm only here just to make you think. You see, because there's a hole in the fabric of history, there's a missing piece in the puzzle of history, and it is defined, the shape of it is defined by the historical facts concerning the death and resurrection of Jesus. And somehow we have got to posit an explanation for those historical facts. Now, there's a traditional way of doing this, and that's something that I did a bit earlier, where I show the historicity of the New Testament documents. And that's the traditional approach. There's even been a legal approach with people like Simon Greenleaf from Harvard University 2 centuries ago, or even John Warwick Montgomery, where they actually put the apostles on trial and applied the legal method of testing their theory, put them on the witness stand. But if you're coming from a secular background, you would scoff at me and say, well, why are you using the Bible to prove the Bible? Why should I even trust your Bible? So there's a novel approach that I want to use today, and that was developed by a few scholars, but especially Dr. Gary Habermas, and that's called the minimum facts approach. And what he does here is a two-step process. So first, you've got to establish the minimal historical facts about the resurrection. And then, like any sort of facts, we have to infer what the best explanation is. So what is the best explanation for these facts? So there are two requirements for what makes a minimal historical fact by Dr. Habermas. First, the fact must be confirmed by multiple historical arguments that must be strong, several, and independent. Secondly, and this is the really tough one, it must be considered historically undeniable by virtually every scholar who studies the subject. Now, I don't know how many of you are in actual academia, but I've been in academia, and my wife has been in academia, and to get scholars to agree on some historical facts, that itself is a miracle, particularly because scholars come from such a broad philosophical and religious spectrum. So the scholars that he catalogs here include atheists, agnostics, Jewish scholars, Christian scholars, every type of Christian scholars, and every person in between. And they all have to agree upon these facts. So the other particular thing about this is that the divine inspiration of any New Testament document is not assumed. So, how do we establish, or what makes a minimum historical fact? There are various historical criteria for this. It has to come from multiple independent sources. Now, the sources that we use come from numerous different formats. So they include letters, biographies, histories, annals, just a whole host, letters. So, and also they must have eyewitness testimony in them, and they have to be remarkably early. Enemy accounts are actually preferable. Now, it may surprise you that there are 17 non-Christian sources within 100 to 150 years of Jesus' death that discuss specifically Jesus. And this is unprecedented. This is actually quite remarkable in terms of history. 12% of these deal with his death, and particularly surprising, 50% of them acknowledge that he was called a deity by his followers. We also include early non-biblical Christian sources, such as the writings of the earliest church fathers like Ignatius, Polycarp. Polycarp wrote in about 80-90, which is in the same century that the eyewitnesses were still alive. And then we also take embarrassing admissions. Some of the embarrassing admissions I will get to a bit later. Now, this is an example of what some of those non-Christian scholars will consider a source. This is 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, and this is considered by even some of the harshest skeptics as a reliable historical source because it's considered to be a form of an early Christian creed. So if you notice the structure here, Paul is talking about something that he receives and delivers. So he's using very ancient rabbinic sort of language here. It's something that Paul is not even allowed to tamper with. He receives and he delivers. Nothing that he can tamper with. And you notice the structure of it. There's a lot of parallelisms involved. And if you even go into the ancient Greek, it has a staccato sort of sound to it. For I deliver to you as of first importance. So this is what Paul is saying is absolute first importance. What I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas. So again, even the use of the word Cephas suggests very ancient use of the term for Peter. And even skeptical scholars date this to, Gerd Ludemann, certainly non-Christian, dates this to 2 years after the crucifixion. Other skeptical scholars date it to within 5 years after the crucifixion, so really early. So what are these minimum historical facts that all scholars, virtually all scholars, agree? That the death of Jesus by crucifixion, Jesus' followers believed that they had experiences of the living Jesus. Paul, a Christian persecutor, also experienced what he believed was the resurrected Messiah. James, Jesus' unbelieving brother, became a Christian as well. I'd just like you to stop and pause for a moment there and think, what will it take for your half-brother or half-sister or even your sibling to be convinced that they should worship you? Point 5, all their lives were transformed as a result, even to the point of being willing to die, specifically for this message. And this message was taught very early, soon after the crucifixion. So some have argued that these facts are too minimum, that there are other historical facts, and certainly Habermas notes 12 other historical facts, which I'm not going to go through, but 2 other facts, especially proposed by William Lane Craig. The explosive origin of Christianity, that is virtually undeniable, and Christianity exploded under persecution. And the fact that the tomb was empty, we have multiple independent and early eyewitness sources for this. Again, implement enemy attestation, and also the fact of embarrassment. And this is quite a big one because of the admission that Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the Sanhedrin, which was the body of rulers that sentenced Jesus to death. He was the one that arose and buried Jesus, not his followers. His followers were out hiding somewhere. And that women were the primary witnesses to this event. Now, we know from Josephus that unfortunately the testimony of women was not considered admissible in the first century in Jewish Palestine. So this was a huge embarrassing point for the Jewish or the early Christian community to propagate this, that women itself were the first witnesses. But the Gospels were faithful in attesting to this. And also you have logic. There's no historical record that despite Jesus being crucified in Jerusalem, being buried in Jerusalem, that nobody produced his body. They could have stopped or quelled this whole start of Christianity had they just gone to the tomb, produced his body. They didn't even produce, some have said, oh, maybe the body was corrupted. They could have produced a bit of his hair. They could have produced a scar, something that could have said, this is Jesus. But we have no record of that. And also to prove that some crucified victims were buried, this is the ossuary or the bone box of the first crucified victim that we have ever discovered archaeologically. Is a young Jewish man. It was discovered in 1968, containing the bones of Yehohanan. And however, in the last 2 decades, 3 other skeletal remains of crucified victims have been found, one in Gavello, Italy, one in Mendes, Egypt, and recently, 2017, in Cambridgeshire in the UK. So, we have to posit an hypothesis for this puzzle of history. These skeptical scholars subscribe to several of these theories. One, apparent death, that Jesus did not die, that somehow he fainted on the cross. 2, hallucination. The disciples experienced hallucination. 3, conspiracy. 4, the woman went to the wrong tomb. And what I find really fascinating is the twin theory. Who, again, is going to convince their twin to be the one to die? But scholars have written articles on this, so I'm not going to contend with scholars. So I just like to say that there's going to be a detour now ahead. And as we discuss the apparent death theory, I want to talk a little bit about the medical aspects of crucifixion. So I just want to warn you that some of you may be sensitive. I am going to cover it in a bit of detail, so just a heads up. Crucifixion was widely used in the Roman Empire. We have accounts of thousands of people being crucified, including 60,000 along the Appian Way, the followers of Spartacus. And Romans did not invent the practice, but they certainly perfected it to be a means of execution that was a way of prolonging death, pure pain, and public humiliation. So let's look at what the non-Christian sources actually say and what we can learn from archaeology about crucifixion. We know from non-Christian sources that before they were crucified, they were tortured and tormented with all forms of torture. From the Cambridgeshire victim, we see the archaeologists that discovered it said there were signs of severe suffering endured prior to death. 6 of the ribs were fractured and the legs bore signs of inflammation. And this is a picture of the Cambridgeshire victim, and you can see the broken ribs there. You can't actually see the legs. And what about the scourging? We know that the Romans used a whip called the fragrum. We have this even on Roman coins and in Roman statues. It was a short whip, leather straps, and it had pieces of animal bone attached to it and also metal balls. So the animal bone would rip into the flesh, causing deep lacerations, while the metal balls would actually cause underlying soft tissue bleeding, something which we call contusions. Now, we know from Josephus' accounts that this was actually a prerequisite before crucifixion, and it was severe, and it often just depended on the mood of the lictors, which were the two people assigned to actually perform this. And we know from Josephus as well that bones were often exposed, and some people even died during the process of scourging. Certainly, if the lung was punctured by one of those sheep bones, you wouldn't last very long. And our earliest picture that image that we have of crucifixion actually is the Pittoli graffiti, and this was discovered in 1959 in Italy, and it dates to the late 1st or early 2nd century. And this is really our earliest image of crucifixion, but I want you just to notice just the deep lacerations across the back and the legs here in this victim. So thereafter, they were forced to carry the patibulum, which was not the entire cross. This was just the crossbar, and this weighed about 35 kilograms because the victim could not carry the entire cross. It wasn't practical. And also they reused the stipes, which was the upright pole, and this was often fixed in the ground, or it was just a simple tree. So also we know that they were crucified along the most crowded roads, and with Josephus we find that it was before the wall of the city. So the method, we know that they were crucified in many different ways. Even amongst church tradition, we have Peter being crucified upside down, Andrew on an X-shaped cross, some with their head to the ground, others with their arms stretched in different postures by way of jest, and nails were used. What about the type of cross? Most often it was the T-shaped cross, which is called the Tor cross, not the traditional Latin cross. And sometimes they used trees. And very importantly, when we consider the apparent death theory, Quintilian says that the executioner did not forbid burial after those bodies were either first pierced with a spear or struck. So with the Mendes victim, we know that the arms and legs were broken, according to the archaeologist, and it was done so intentionally by a sharp rap with some blunt instrument. So this is a reproduction of Yehohanan's bones, and because his bones were rapidly buried after discovery. And you have here a 4.5-inch nail. There's a piece of olive wood between the head of the nail and the calcaneus, which is the heel bone, and that was to prevent the victim from freeing his legs. With the case of Yehohanan, there was no indication of nails going through the hands, and this is perfectly fitting because the most logical place to place the nails was actually between the radius and ulna, which is soft tissue. So this is how Yehohanan's legs would have looked, but with the Gavello victim, they used one nail actually, which is likely in the case of Jesus, whereas Yehohanan, they used two nails. So how does the gospel narrative compare with the historical record? And it compares absolutely remarkably. Two extra things that we know from the Gospels is the case of hematohydrosis. In Gethsemane, Jesus is said to have sweated blood. Now, this is a rare clinical condition that does occur under periods of extreme stress, and it's more common in pediatric patients than in adults. So that's a picture of a case of hematohydrosis, which is the sweating of blood in a pediatric case. And we know that Jesus was scourged. We know he had a crown of thorns, as well as he was executed in a public, crowded place outside the walls. We also know that his garment was removed, which was a particularly painful piece of the whole torture, because it would have basically reopened all the wounds, as well as nails were used in Jesus' case. A very fascinating point, an eyewitness account, just the condition of Jesus' state after the whipping was the fact that Jesus could not carry his own patibulum. And Simon of Cyrene had to be forced to carry this. So we already know that the condition of Jesus is very poor. He cannot actually carry his patibulum. We know it was likely a very short cross. So the images of Jesus is really on a tall cross. The whole point of crucifixion was to be on a low cross. You could have conversations with the victim as they're dying, and to ensure this humiliation. And also we have this because of the length of the hyssop stalk and the Roman spear, it had to be a short cross. We also know that Jesus was pierced with a spear. Now this I find particularly fascinating from a medical perspective, because this can only be an eyewitness account. The fact that John says that both blood and water came out, that is just an eyewitness account that only physicians know about. Because we know that under states of extreme torture, fluid fills in all body cavities. We see this in ICU patients very quickly around the lungs, pleural effusions, very common, ascites occur. So the fact that if a spear would have gone through his side, through the chest, the first thing it would have hit would have been water. And when we put in chest drains, that's the first thing we see. First comes water and then blood. Really classic eyewitness testimony here. How did Jesus die? If I had to sign the death certificate, Jesus is considered a polytrauma patient. Now, there are multiple conditions that he possibly could have died of, and numerous doctors of outstanding pedigree have posited different explanations for the final cause of death of Jesus. But certainly these were the top three theories that I would propose how Jesus actually died. Number one, hypovolemic shock. 2, asphyxiation. And 3, acidosis, which is basically the pH in the blood is very tightly controlled. You start erring towards the more acid side, you're going to get electrolyte abnormalities, arrhythmias, and that itself can cause death. So we know Jesus was already dehydrated, walked about 4 miles before he even began his trial, and the blood loss was ongoing, and this certainly contributed to the hypovolemic shock. The position, we know in medicine something called suspension trauma, and that would have contributed to the shock, but predominantly contributed to the suffocation. It was a slow period of suffocation. Jesus every time would have had to breathe. Every time he breathed, he would have had to physically lift himself up, pivot on the nails, and taking a breath, and ultimately you're going to suffocate and die from that. And the effect of pain, we know this particularly in anesthesia. So let's talk about the apparent death theory. Detour ended. This is a lol theory. It's really a joke because it completely jokes about what we know about our medical understanding of crucifixion. It jokes about what we know about the historical understanding of crucifixion. It makes a joke of the Roman executioners who were really perfected this form of torture. It makes a joke of the disciples that this half-dead, half-comatose Jesus knocking on their door after pushing away the stone and coming to see them. They wouldn't have called him the risen Savior, they would have considered him a Savior that needed saving. They wouldn't have called him the conqueror of death. They would have called a doctor. The other point is that it's a bias against the ancients. This is something called the genetic fallacy. And we assume here that the ancients do not know how to diagnose death. What about hallucination? So this is probably the most popular theory among skeptical scholars, that the disciples had hallucinations of the risen Jesus. And why could this not be possible? First of all, in medicine, hallucinations generally involve one sense. So in cases like schizophrenia, it's predominantly auditory hallucinations. You can get visual hallucinations. And the type of hallucinations is related to the pathology that you're having. So if somebody's going through alcohol withdrawal, they normally have tactile hallucinations, like the sensation of spiders running on their body. That's classical DTs or withdrawal. So it's very specific. You're not going to get like a hallucination of a person standing there, clearly auditory, visual, tactile, all at the same time. And also the people having the hallucinations, there's something wrong with them. Hallucinations is a symptom that something's really not right. Anyway, bereavement. So, just before that, the appearances that are described, however, it involves both individuals and groups. That's another problem. How do you have a group hallucination? I would really like to know. Maybe me and my family, we just decide, let's just have a hallucination. We are in the Bahamas, sipping on a pina colada. Let's just all go there together. That, for me, just doesn't make sense. We know that Jesus appeared to up to 500 people at one stage. We know he met with groups of disciples, multiple occasions, different locations. And the odd thing is that this was physical, not bodily. Bereavement hallucinations are fairly common among spouses and loved ones who believe that they can hear or have senses or that they have seen their loved ones who have just died. But that serves as a confirmation of death. How many people who have died, whose spouses have died, actually go about saying, hang on, my spouse is actually alive? So I'll leave that with you. Again, it doesn't explain Paul of Tarsus. He was not bereaving Jesus. He actually would have been happy Jesus actually died. It doesn't explain the empty tomb. And it doesn't explain the harder route that the apostles took. Why not say, hang on, Jesus was spiritually resurrected. His body is still in the tomb, but we are experiencing him all the time. We are experiencing his spirit. No, they actually took the harder route, that Jesus bodily resurrected. Also, in the ancients actually have terms for something called spirit and something called ghost. And they do not use this when it comes to Jesus of Nazareth. So what about conspiracy theory? Well, these 12 fishermen would have pulled out the greatest scam in history, undoubtedly. Why would they invent women or Joseph of Arimathea as the primary witnesses to the empty tomb? The conspiracy theory does not explain how Paul became a convert, how James, how the transformation of the disciples, and we know from logic that liars make poor martyrs. Nobody dies for a lie. People may die for something they genuinely believe in, but nobody really dies for a lie. And I think the greatest of this is they underestimate the catastrophe of the cross. We are so used to looking at the cross through the colored lens of history. We see so many of us now wearing a cross. It's so common. But if you look at the cross to a Jewish and a Roman mind, Cicero said it was the most cruel and disgusting punishment. The very mention of the cross should be far removed from a Roman citizen's body, not only from his body, but from his mind, his eyes, and his ears. Josephus said it was the most wretched of deaths, and we know from Deuteronomy, cursed is the man who hangs on a tree. There was no concept of a dying and rising Messiah. There was no concept to the Jewish mind of a resurrecting Messiah. The image of the cross was horrific to the Roman mind. And this is our earliest image of Jesus on the cross. This comes from the Palatine Hill, and it dates to 90 to 200. Some have even dated it closer to 90. And it just shows the greatest foolishness of the Christian message compared to the greatest growth. It says Alexamenos worships his God. Alexamenos was likely an early Christian. And here you have this graffiti where Alexamenos is raising his hand, but he's worshiping a God with the head of a donkey. This is Jesus, the first image we have of Jesus. That is why Paul says in 1 Corinthians, we preach Christ crucified, which is foolishness to the Greek and a stumbling block to the Gentile. Jesus died a failure. The story should have ended there, but we have to posit an explanation for the historical facts. We have to be intellectually honest, compare the explanations, and consider the evidence, and there are various historical criteria. Now, I have to differentiate between the occurrence of this historical event versus the meaning of the historical event. Some have protested you cannot assess the resurrection because of its meaning. No, we can, because we are not assessing the meaning of the historical event. We are assessing the occurrence of the historical event. Now, in conclusion, I just want to leave you with this from Acts 17, where Paul's on Mars Hill and he says, God has given us assurance. He has given us guarantee, a pledge, a certainty to all by raising Jesus Christ from the dead. And N.T. Wright says this quite beautifully, and he says, all this evidence is useful about the resurrection of Jesus, but you should consider it like a candle that you light in a dark room. And with this candle, you go to find the door. And you open up the door, and then you bask in the glory of the rising sun. Thank you for your time.
Hello. Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Raphael. Can we just give him another round of applause? So now is, I think, the time that a lot of you would probably be more interested in as well, alongside the talk, is to ask to have your questions potentially be answered. And so if you can scan this QR code or go to whatever internet browser you use, slido.com, all you have to do is just enter those numbers 2585732, and all of your questions will be sent anonymously, and Dr. Raphael will have a chance to also answer your questions. So we'll give you guys a couple of minutes to type in your questions, and then we'll transition into the Q&A period. Thank you.
Awesome. Good. Just while you are... Can you hear me? Yeah, just while you are thinking about this, I just don't want you to get me wrong. I went through a lot of medical details about the death of Jesus, but this is probably the hardest talk I've ever had to prepare for on this subject, because the cross of Christ is profoundly personal for me. And, I had to step aside and take it objectively as I possibly could. But don't ever get me wrong that, me being sort of factual about this is any way diminishes how much the cross means to me. In fact, one of the biggest questions that I really struggled with when I was preparing this talk was just asking God, Lord, why crucifixion? There's so many other ways to die. And I really struggled with that because, Paul had his head chopped off. I mean, that's like 30 seconds and you're dead. Socrates drank hemlock, the Greek philosopher, as his form of execution. But God chose the cross for Jesus. And I really think that the reason for this is because this is really the greatest paradox in all of history, that it's the very worst of us. We invented the cross. Humans invented this form of torture, which I am convinced is the worst way to actually die. But on the other hand, it's a display of the greatest love, the great love that God has for us. There's no other place in history where justice and judgment and holiness is actually tempered by grace and mercy. You name me any other place in history that actually does that, where evil is met with love. There really is no other focal point in history than the cross of Jesus.
And so, I'm seeing all of your questions, and we'll now get into our Q&A session. And thank you for that brief message, Dr. Raphael. And so, I know you touched briefly on one of the purposes of the crucifixion was humiliation as well, right? And so, what is the overarching motive that the Romans had when it came to the crucifixion? What exactly was the purpose of it, and what did it achieve? Even for the Roman Empire, since they were the ones that used this type of torture method?
Well, that's a interesting and good question. The Romans didn't invent it. It was invented by the Persians, and it sort of developed over the ages. The Persians sort of first started off by impaling people. So we have this, even if you go to the British Museum, you'll see the Lachish frescoes, from the time of like Sennacherib. You have the Assyrians who start impaling people, and there's graphic images of people being impaled on poles. And so the Persians took that over, and then the Romans adopted it. Really, it was a very slow way to die. Roman citizens were not allowed to be crucified. That is why Paul actually was not crucified, because he was a Roman citizen. It was illegal for a Roman citizen to be crucified. But if you were not a Roman citizen, and particularly if you were a slave, you could be crucified. And interestingly, one of the punishments for slaves, just to keep them in check, there's a historical account of the punishment of a slave who killed his master. All the slaves that the master owned will be crucified. Now, we have a historical record of something like one guy owning 200, I could be getting the numbers wrong, 200 slaves. He got killed by his slave. The Romans debated about it, but they went on and they crucified those 200 people. It was just a really humiliating, agonizing, slow way to die. Every time you breathe on the cross, it's painful. In order to breathe, you have to pivot. So your back is rubbing against the rough wood. You slowly suffocate. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And just adding on top of that as well, with the purpose of the crucifixion, and what exactly did it achieve. In retrospect, what did it also achieve for Christianity, or even for the belief itself? How did it add on top of the gospel message that we potentially would hear whenever it comes to these sorts of questions?
Well, I think for historically, it was an embarrassing fact for the Christians. The Christians, there is no early picture of Jesus crucified. The fact that we all wear crosses, it's just because in the 4th century it was outlawed, crucifixion as a means of torture. No Christian would want to associate themselves with wearing a cross. The earliest pictures we have of Jesus is as a good shepherd in the catacombs, or we have the symbol of the fish, which is one of the earliest Christian symbols, which means iectos. But the association with the cross, nobody wanted to associate. So it was actually a foolish message, and yet Christianity grew despite this.
Yeah, and so we looked at the historical and the medical evidences of the death and the resurrection of Jesus, and you also pulled up all these different evidences, and so what does this mean for us today? How do these historical and medical evidences mean for a person that would come across these sorts of topics?
Well, I think that we have external evidence for our faith. I think this is what makes Christianity very unique. We have a reason for hope. Peter says in 1 Peter 3:16, always be prepared to give an apologia or a defense for anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that you have. We have reasons for the hope, and it's outside the Bible. It's outside the realm of spirituality. It's in history that we have this. And I think it helps you to answer not just others, but it helps you to answer the greatest critic, which is yourself. There will be times in your life where you will have doubt. You will doubt the presence of God. You will doubt that He exists. But you can always lean on this hope that we have, and particularly even in Dr. Gary Habermas's case. His wife was diagnosed with cancer. He took time off from his PhD works, and he was feeding her, taking care of her, and she died. But during that time, he prayed, and he felt God really telling him or asking him, in this dark time for him, did I rise from the dead? So when life happens, you will always be able to turn back and ask yourself or say, but Jesus died from the dead. But Jesus rose from the dead. But Jesus rose from the dead.
And so the resurrection is seen to be such a great miracle in the Christian faith. And so, what would you say to someone who doesn't believe in miracles? Is there any other potential explanation that is better than the resurrection, even if it's not likely?
Well, if you don't believe in the resurrection as the best possible hypothesis for the events, then I would point out to that person that their disbelief is not because of historical fact, it is because of worldview or philosophy. So they are limiting themselves in their best explanation because of their worldview. and because of their philosophy or because of their belief that there's no supernatural. But they're excluding something that is not based on historical evidence.
You also briefly shared to us Paul's letter to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 15 about he received a message and then he delivered it. And so how exactly does this, play a role in the forgiveness of sins, since the death and the resurrection of Christ, when people hear about it, it's always so tightly connected to this notion of sin. So how would you go about that?
So I just love First Corinthians 15. I love looking at it in the Bible, seeing that it's there. Sometimes I'd even touch it, because that is the earliest Christian creed that we know of. There are other creeds that we have that scholars recognize in the New Testament documents, but really, for skeptics to actually date this within 2 to 5 years after the crucifixion, that is phenomenal. And that's coming from skeptical authors, not from Christian authors, just on the weight of the evidence about its historicity. Again, what I discussed primarily was the occurrence of a historical event and not about the meaning of the historical event. The fact that Jesus rose from the dead makes him very unique, number one, because dead people don't rise, and number two is that he had said certain things before he died, that God will vindicate him, that the sign that God will give will be the sign of Jonah. When the Jewish people asked for a sign, that 3 days Jonah was in the belly of the whale. And so this vindicates all that Jesus said. So it's not just about anyone rising from the dead, it's about who actually rose from the dead.
And looking further down in that passage as well, Paul writes that Jesus, in his resurrected body, appeared to more than 500 people. And so how can we be sure that there were 500 eyewitnesses if this statement came from just one person?
Well, I go to the next line in that statement, because it says, Paul says, many of whom are still alive today. So that's an open challenge. Paul is actually saying, go ask them yourself. Many of those 500 are still alive. And we think it's actually more, because generally they speak about 500 men. So if it was a traditional gathering of Jesus in Galilee, there would have been women there would have been children. So just the charge of Paul to go test it out, go and see for yourself. I'm delivering to you what I first received, which is of first importance. Da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da.
And as this is coming from a Christian perspective, how does the historical, just a quick overview, how does the historical evidence for Christianity compare to other religions such as Islam, Hinduism, or even Judaism?
Well, thank you for your question. That's a very good question. And I don't think, particularly as far as I'm aware, Hinduism, Buddhism, it's none of these, like certainly Buddha did not claim to be God. And in fact, pure Buddhism, there actually is no God. It's a oneness with the universe. That's what you're aiming for. It's all about spiritual experience. It's all about teaching and whether you believe the teaching. There's no basis of any historical event that you could actually say that is the central part of Buddhism or Hinduism. And Hinduism itself, I grew up in a community that were full of Hindus. There is no historical event. There are lots of stories, and there's lots of teachings, and it largely depends on which guru that you sit under and which part of Hinduism that you subscribe to. And certainly in Islam, it gets a bit different there, because one of the key tenets of Islam is the denial of the death of Jesus. They deny that Jesus actually died on the cross, which places them at odds with with historical consensus. The historical consensus of basically all other historians who look at this. One thing that they all agree on, or vast majority of them agree on, no matter what belief that they have, is that Jesus did die by crucifixion. Secondly, with regards to Islam, there is a note, I think, I can't remember where the claim is, that Jesus did not die, but it appeared as if he died. And then that would beg the question, why would God want to deceive so many people, to make it appear to them? And basically, because of the deception of so many people, we have 1 billion Christians, and Christians in all history, that have believed a deception. Why would God want to do that?
And staying on the topic of the perspectives of different faiths, what do you say to other religions that have gods and have historical data to also back up their beliefs and their deities? Are those just as possible? And is there historical data to back up other religions and their beliefs? Was that something you came across when?
Not that I'm aware of. Well, Judaism has historical data, but that's our bigger brother in faith. So we believe what the Jewish Torah actually says. In terms of historicity of other religions, I'm not really aware of anyone actually applying these minimal facts to any other religion. So if somebody is welcome to bring up some historical thoughts or some historical evidence, I'll be happy to sit and listen to it.
And our next question is, in your opinion, does the preoccupation with scientific evidence make people unwilling to accept historical evidence, particularly as it relates to the Bible?
That's a great question. You know, Bertrand Russell once said, what science could not tell us, mankind cannot know. Now, if you stop, now he was a brilliant logician. Some of you may know who Bertrand Russell was. He was a very, very famous atheist. He was a brilliant logician, but his logic seems to have departed him from during that statement, because number one, that is not a scientific statement. If you think of, if science cannot tell us, what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know, that's a philosophical statement. So science doesn't tell us everything. If science was the only way of knowing things, we would have to close most of our academic departments in all our universities. Literally close them. I see where, and that's a common misconception that we have. So if I had to medically examine my wife, if I had to take blood tests on her, and if I had to put her in an MRI suite, and we have some complex MRIs now, you know, CAT scan, PET scans and SPECT scans that actually show which area of your brain is working when you experience certain emotions, just to find out that she loves me. Well, I know she loves me, not because of something science could tell me, but something that I know via relationship. And that's the important thing, is that God wants to be in relationship with us. As I pointed out to you, all this evidence is just like this little candle that you use to open up the door and bask in the glory of the rising sun. God wants to have a relationship with us. He wants us to taste and see that the Lord is good. All of this pales in comparison to knowing Him personally, to experiencing His love. And you can only know that through a relationship. And the Christian God is a personal God. He steps into history compared to all other gods. John says in his gospel, the Word became flesh, and literally He pitched His tent among us. The word used there is skinu. He literally skinued. He pitched His tent with us. John says in his first letter, that which we have seen with our eyes and heard with our ears and touched with our hands concerning the word of life, we now testify to you. Notice the involvement of the senses. This is not as much spiritual as in the whole being.
Thank you. You shared some alternative theories that may seem unlikely, and as you made the case, but on the other hand, wouldn't a physical resurrection be an unlikely alternative theory as well? So how do you compare the unlikeliness of the resurrection and then all of these different alternative theories that you shared that seem unlikely?
Would you be able to skip back to a few of my slides on best explanation? Just it says best explanation there. No, the other way. The other way, like towards the end, there's a puzzle piece that's missing. Yeah, so we have historical criteria. And McCulloch's criteria is really considered the historical standard to assess historical data. So once you establish the historical facts, you apply McCulloch's criteria, which hypothesis, and you literally, the hypothesis, you test the different hypotheses. Which hypothesis has the greatest explanatory scope? So which one explains all the facts? Which historical hypothesis has the greatest explanatory power? Which is more plausible? Which is less ad hoc? Which is disconfirmed by fewer accepted beliefs? And there's a few more. But this is just logic. When I'm assessing a patient that's under anesthesia and suddenly things start going wrong, what do? I gather the facts. The patient's oxygen levels are dropping. His blood pressure has dropped. The airway pressures have suddenly increased. So I've gathered these facts, and now I'm applying these facts to make a diagnosis. I have to know what is the most likely diagnosis in order to diagnose this. And sometimes you don't even have time. When you're dealing with a cardiac arrest situation, you have to quickly gather all the facts and then go through your differential diagnosis, go through the different explanations, and come up with a working diagnosis in order to treat it. Now, the diagnosis may be vastly different. Some people may die from an electrolyte abnormality, going to ventricular fibrillation because their potassium is so high. Some may have a pneumothorax. So it's completely different. But you have to use logic and use common sense and a method to whittle out this diagnosis, whittle out that. Let's focus on this. Let's treat the patient for this.
And one of the things you shared about was like the theory of like there could have been mass hallucinations. Similarly, around I believe in the late 1600s, the Salem witch trials took place. And so in these Salem witch trials, they found that in wheat there was this kind of fungus called ergot fungus, which caused mass hallucinations. So why isn't a similar altered perception at play here?
I'm not so familiar with the Salem witch hunt hallucinations, but what I can say, I mean, if it was as clear as the multiple experiences on different locations, involving different people, involving skeptics, people, from really different locations, some in Jerusalem, some in Galilee, and then to believe that there was some fungus that was only affecting the disciples and certain people that happened later, like the appearance to Paul happened later, likely on the Damascus Road. I think you would have more faith to believe that it was related to a fungus than to have faith that it was that it occurred as the people who saw it said it did.
I myself see sometimes these news, or some sort of medical news about a person actually rising from the dead, where some doctors claim that this person's heart stopped, or clearly there was no way for them to come back alive. So, from a medical perspective, how can a person rise from the dead?
As I said right at the beginning, dead people don't rise. But again, I would be restraining myself by my philosophical worldview and ignoring the historical facts and the historical evidence. And yes, there has been occurrences of people that the diagnosis of death was incorrect, but the vast majority of those people died a few days later. They were so critically ill that they were incorrectly diagnosed with death, and quite a few of them actually died a few days later. They were discovered in the morgue that they still had a pulse rate and they were still alive. But then again, as I said, you are displaying a bias against the ancients. You are displaying a bias against the Roman executioners, against the disciples, against what we know about Roman crucifixion. People that actually died and rose from the dead, it was mainly medical causes that, resulted in them being comatose, or bradycardia, where their pulses are so weak. But I've unfortunately seen a lot of people die, or a lot of people really close to death. And one thing that I can tell you is that those people are still breathing. In fact, their respiratory rate is even increased, so they're breathing faster. And just before they die, they go into a phase called agonal respiration, which is deep sighing respiration, that unless you apply CPR, they're going to die. And that is clearly obvious. Dying people or comatose people also have to breathe.
For this next question, I believe this person is assuming that Jesus' body got better, as opposed to some Christians believing that Christ received a new body when he was resurrected. And so how would you explain the degree of Jesus' healing, because the scars in his hand, when he went on to live for several months despite seemingly debilitating injuries?
Sorry, I don't really quite understand that question.
So I believe when Jesus appeared to his disciples, or to
he had scars.
He had scars in his hand, but so how would you explain the degree of the healing? There was no sort of
I believe from what we gather from the historical accounts and from the gospel accounts, that Jesus' body was changed, that this was his glorified body. This was the body he still has, and this is the body that will never see death again. But it is the glorified body of Jesus. And we know this because Jesus, still very physical, but still has the ability to move through closed doors, still has the ability to disappear, like on the road to Emmaus, when he meets those followers walking towards Emmaus from Jerusalem. So it's a different body. But I think the presence of the scar, and I think it was completely transformed and completely healed physiologically. But the purpose of the scars is for us, that we always know that there is evidence on the body of Jesus that our sins have been forgiven, that he has paid the price for our sins. And even to show his disciples that this is really him and that he really experienced this.
And so we talked about the historical and the medical evidences, and you also shared some of your personal accounts to what the death and resurrection of Jesus means to you. And so just for this last question, I think this goes for all of us. I think we're very curious is, what does Jesus' death and resurrection mean for me, for us today?
How long do you have? Well, I think it's a life-transforming event. We are Christian because we believe that Jesus is who he said he is, and and we believe that he is both Lord and Savior. And his saving work was done on the cross of Calvary, and God vindicated him. God has given us certainty and assurance, this guarantee of all of this by raising him. So we can rely on what he said was true. We can trust his words, because whenever I have a doubt, whenever somebody raises some objection against Christianity, I personally will stick with what the person who rose from the dead said. And that's just my philosophy in life. I'll stick with the one who rose from the dead.
Well, that ends our Q&A session. Can we just please give another round of applause for Dr. Raphael?
Great to be here.
And so, this we'll just go through a couple more minutes together. But if you're interested for more other talks as well for this later week, today was about God and the Bible and history. Tomorrow's themes are God in science and medicine. Wednesdays is God in gender and relationships, and Thursday is God in human life and suffering. And then Friday, for our last talk, we'll be going through God and people in culture. And so if you're interested, again, please go to relevantseries.com, or even go to this link tree, which will give you, which will basically send you to a website with all of the information of the different talks. Tomorrow's evening talk, we don't have a lunch talk for tomorrow, but for tomorrow's evening talk, it will be faith in science, as you can see here on the Tuesday schedule. Is science compatible with faith in God? And that will be given by Dr. Ewan Gallagher, who's also actually an associate professor here at U of T. So that's something that's really cool. And I believe for the next slide, if you're please, we would like to invite you to fill out a feedback form. So please take the time to scan this QR code. Who likes gift cards here? Free gift cards, by the way. You don't have to pay for them. Okay, so if you fill out this feedback form and you give your contact information, you will be entered into a draw for a free gift card. So if that is something that you're interested in. And we just want to ask just how this talk was, what could have been improved, what could have been, just so that when we do have these talks in the future, that we'll keep in mind in terms of whatever it is that you guys have given. We also want to, if you're interested with a follow-up, that's also an option in the feedback form. And if you're interested in joining like a Christian club here on campus, as I mentioned here earlier, Relevance Series is a collaboration with so many different Christian fellowships here on campus. So there's a place on the form to indicate that. And then you can also sign up for Christianity Explored as well. If you're interested in what Christianity Explored is, it is a place for you to explore what the Christian faith is all about and finding out more about who Jesus is and why he came. And then if that is something that is of interest to you, Christianity Explored is a great course for you to attend. It is free, it is informal, it's a relaxed 7-week course that just goes through all these questions. You don't need to know anything about the Bible, you don't need to be well-versed in the Bible or be a scholar in that area. But you can just ask any questions you like, and we will just be there to just have a great discussion and conversation with one another. If you go to the next slide, it will be a quick trailer of Christianity Explored.
A committed Christian, or somewhere in between. Perhaps you've lots of questions to ask, or perhaps you're happier just sitting and listening. Maybe you go to church, or maybe you've never been. Whoever you are, Christianity Explored is a place for you to explore what life is all about. The Christianity Explored course is free, it's relaxed and informal, and it's run by ordinary people local to you. Some courses are held in churches with lots of people. Some are held in people's houses with just a few friends getting together. Wherever you meet, in each session, there's a chance to look at the life of Jesus for yourself and ask any questions you have. There's a short video to watch, and then a chance to chat about what you've just heard. You'll meet great people. You won't be asked to sing or pray or read out loud, and you don't need to know anything about the Bible to enjoy it. So whoever you are, come and explore. There's almost certainly a Christianity Explored course starting near you soon. So ask a Christian friend, or check out the website to find out more. You might just discover that the Christian message really is the best news you've ever heard.
And as the video mentioned, there is going to be a Christianity Explored that will be offered here at Wycliffe. It will be starting on Thursday, January 23rd, so next week at 5 p.m. So it's not this week, but it's next week. And if you are interested in being a part of it, I mentioned again that there was a feedback form, so please do fill that out. If you're interested, please feel free to stay behind to chat. This room is open. We also have some free snacks, some light refreshments in case you weren't able to grab them when you got in here. And so if something you heard was really interested to you, or if you posed a question and it was able to make it into the Q&A, and if you want to talk to someone about it, Dr. Raphael is gracious enough to be here for the next couple of minutes after today's talk to answer those questions. You can also ask any of your questions to any of the volunteers which have their lanyard with them, including me and some of our ushers back there. And we just want to thank our sponsors as well. Just because of them that we're able to have these talks possible. And so, it's day one, and we're so excited to see you again in our next future talks. It's been a pleasure to be your MC, and have a great evening. Good night. And if you are interested, Dr. Raphael will be here at the front to answer any of your questions.